Listen close, friend, and let me spin you a yarn from the dusty plains of the American West. A story so unexpected it'll rattle the spurs right off your boots. Picture a rugged widower, haunted by tragedy, crossing paths with a headstrong bride who's been deemed too fat and left behind at a bustling railroad station. In the midst of railroad whistles and cinders in the wind, destiny throws these two lost souls together. By day's end, they tie the knot without a second thought, igniting a chain of dramatic twists none could have foreseen. Saddle up and hold tight. This is one cold ride you won't forget. In the sweltering heat of August 1883, Jim Holloway stepped off a stagecoach in Dodge City, Kansas, carrying little more than grief and a worn saddlebag. A widower haunted by the deaths of his wife and child, he had no plans to stay, just earn a few coins and move on. But as he scanned the bustling train station, something unusual caught his eye. A stout woman in a purple gown sitting alone on a trunk, scanning the crowd with a tense expression. People gave her passing glances, some indifferent, some unkind. Jim couldn't look away. Steam hissed from a freshly arrived locomotive as passengers spilled onto the platform. Families reunited gamblers headed to saloons, but Jim's gaze kept returning to the stranded woman. She looked lost, her shoulders sagging beneath the weight of abandonment. Despite every instinct to keep to himself, something about her loneliness stirred his long-dormant sense of compassion. Without a clear plan, he took a step toward her. Her name was Clara Davenport. When Jim drew close, he heard her murmuring with the station master, her voice trembling with anger and despair. She kept glancing at a crumpled envelope in her hand, which presumably contained the address or the name of the man supposed to meet her train. That man apparently had yet to appear, or had decided not to appear at all. Clara had arrived to be a mail-order bride, an arrangement not uncommon in the West, where men outnumbered women and lonely ranchers sometimes placed adverts seeking companionship. Jim overheard her telling the station master that her intended had deemed her too big, and on catching a glimpse of her from a distance, turned on his heel and fled without a word. Jim felt a surge of anger at the cruelty. He'd seen a fair amount of callousness in his days. This was the frontier after all, but to abandon a woman in need went beyond the pale. He remembered how delicate his late wife's feelings could be, how vulnerable a person was when stepping into marriage. If there was one truth he'd learned in life, it was that heartbreak could leave scars far deeper than any bullet wound. Without fully understanding his own actions, he approached and asked if she was all right. Clara's wide brown eyes flicked toward him, shining with unshed tears. At first she seemed guarded, uncertain whether to trust a stranger. But something in Jim's steady gaze and gentle tone must have reassured her. She explained the situation in halting words, how she'd traveled for days, expecting to begin a new life on a ranch with a man named Robert Price. How she'd disembarked, only to find herself alone with no place to go. Wordlessly, Jim removed his hat and ran a hand through his dark, sweat-dampened hair. He'd hardly expected to start the day by rescuing a woman from heartbreak. "Ma'am," he said gently, "I reckon you need a place to stay at least for the night." The station master chimed in, explaining that the local inn was well enough, but it was prone to rowdy drifters and had only the barest accommodations left. Clara's voice shook. "I don't know what to do. I have nowhere else to go." She set her parasol down and pressed the heel of her hand against her temple as though trying to steady the swirl of hopelessness within. "I can help you find a safer boarding house," Jim offered. He hesitated, feeling an odd tug in his chest. He was a man who'd locked away his heart. But some portion of his old self, the man who believed in doing the right thing, flared to life. There's a place near the edge of town run by Mrs. Farnsworth. She's decent folk. She might be able to give you a good rate and some peace. Clara pursed her lips, searching Jim's face, as though trying to decide if he was trustworthy. In that moment, a gust of wind whipped her hair from its pinned arrangement. The curls tumbled about her flushed cheeks, and Jim sensed not just vulnerability, but also a fierce resilience behind her eyes. "Thank you," she finally said, swallowing hard. I came here to be wed. I don't know what happens next." Her words trembled like an autumn leaf about to fall. Jim arranged for the station master to keep an eye on Clara's trunk, then led her by the elbow off the platform. The afternoon sun bore down on them, intensifying the dust that clung to the folds of their clothing. Clara dabbed at her brow with a linen handkerchief. Together they walked in uneasy silence past the row of saloons where rowdy cattlemen lingered. Some eyed Clara with interest, others with rude snickering. Jim shot a cold glare that silenced a few lecherous remarks. They neared Farnsworth's boarding house. It was a modest 2-story wood-framed structure with chipped paint, but it was known in town for its respectable quiet and good meals. Mrs. Farnsworth, a round, motherly figure in her 50s, greeted them at the door. She recognized Jim from a past short stay during one of his itinerant stints. "Well, Mr. Holloway," she said, "it's been a while since you've come round these parts." "And who might this be, Mrs. Davenport?" Clara corrected gently. "Or that is Miss Davenport." Her face flushed as she recalled that her intended had walked out on her. "I'm in need of lodging." Mrs. Farnsworth took in the situation with a discerning eye, glimpsing the heartbreak etched on Clara's expression and the concern on Jim's. "Well, we've got a comfortable room upstairs. Supper is at 7. If you two need anything, just holler." Clara managed a grateful if weary smile. She slipped inside, leaving Jim alone with Mrs. Farnsworth in the entryway. He explained that Clara had been abandoned. Mrs. Farnsworth shook her head in dismay. "Poor dear. Men can be brutes." Jim winced at that, reminded of how men's cruelty had shaped so many destinies out here on the frontier, including his own, when tragedy struck. Later that evening, Jim found himself unable to leave Dodge City as he'd first planned. Something about Clara's plight weighed on his conscience. He dined at Farnsworth's boarding house, though typically he might have spent the night over a whiskey at the Long Branch Saloon, scrounging for work. Instead, he took a seat across from Clara at the small dining table. Mrs. Farnsworth served venison stew, cornbread, and fresh peas from her garden. Clara ate in polite, measured bites, though her eyes spoke of a ravenous hunger. A silence hung between them, broken occasionally by polite questions. Jim inquired about Clara's home back east. She admitted she was from the outskirts of Philadelphia, working as a seamstress, before responding to Robert Price's advertisement for a bride. "I dreamed of a new life," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of regret and defiance. "I'm not a small woman, I know that. But that man wrote of wanting a hearty wife with strong arms to help run a ranch. I never expected to be cast off the moment he laid eyes on me." Jim frowned, swirling the stew in his bowl. He could scarcely imagine how humiliating that must have felt. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "No one deserves that." They finished supper under the watchful maternal eye of Mrs. Farnsworth. When Jim rose to leave, Clara caught his wrist. "Thank you," she whispered. Her eyes glistened. "You've shown me more kindness in a day than he ever did in all his letters. He didn't know how to respond. He merely nodded and dipped his head in farewell. Outside, the moon cast silver light across the dusty street. Jim stood there for a long while, hands jammed in his pockets, lost in thought. The spark of empathy he felt for Clara was both unsettling and oddly comforting, like feeling a faint pulse in a long, numbed limb. Over the next few days, Dodge City pressed on in its typical hot, rowdy manner. Cattle drivers brawled, gamblers laid down cards, and trains steamed in and out. Jim had found a little work as a handyman at one of the local stables, cleaning stalls and hauling feed. It was unglamorous labor, but it put a few coins in his pocket. More importantly, it gave him an excuse to stay in the area, though he wouldn't admit it out loud, not even to himself. On the second day, he rode out on a borrowed mule to survey a small acreage he'd once considered renting. The land was a patch of dusty plains north of town, near the Arkansas River. Nothing thrived out there, except for scraggly brush, but with enough grit and water one could eke out a living. Jim told himself he was simply looking for opportunities, a chance to settle for a while and earn enough to keep moving. But in truth, a stirring within him asked, what if you actually stayed? What if you helped Clara figure out her next step? He dismissed the thought as foolish. He was a widower with sorrow stained into his bones. She deserved better than a broken man like him. But the question lingered all the same. By the time he returned to Farnsworth's for supper, he found Clara seated alone on the porch, her wide eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for something. Or maybe someone. She looked up as he approached. "Good evening, Mr. Holloway," she greeted, half rising from her seat. He tipped his hat in reply. He saw that despite her heartbreak, there was a quiet determination in her eyes, a willingness to stand strong in the face of adversity. "How are you holding up?" he asked. Clara managed a small smile. "Mrs. Farnsworth has been kind, but I can't stay here forever. I don't know how I'll afford the rent. My funds, well, I spent most of them getting here." Jim leaned against the porch rail, looking out at the silhouettes of buildings in the fading twilight. "You mentioned you're a seamstress. Maybe you can find work. Dodge City's got plenty of folks who tear their clothes in bar fights," he said, half joking. She sighed. "I suppose I'll try. But I had pinned all my hopes on marriage. Perhaps that was foolish of me. All my life people have judged me for my size. I thought in the West, where folks need strong backs and bigger hearts, I'd be accepted." Jim's heart clenched. Her words resonated in a deeper way than he cared to admit. Everyone was searching for acceptance one way or another. "You're not the fool," he said firmly, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. He was for not seeing what you have to offer. Clara's eyes flicked to his. For a moment, their gazes held an unspoken warmth passing between them. Then she cleared her throat and looked away. "Thank you," she murmured. That night, Jim wrestled with restless thoughts. Why did he feel compelled to protect her? Where was this sudden urge coming from? Ever since losing his wife and child to fever, he'd sworn off emotional attachments. Yet here he was, tethered to the idea of seeing Clara safe, perhaps even content. A few more days dragged by. Clara found small tasks around town, mending shirts for the local blacksmith's wife and hemming dresses for the Farnsworth sisters. But it was hardly enough to pay her room and board. Jim did what he could. He'd discreetly slip Mrs. Farnsworth a few extra coins to cover Clara's meals. He told himself it was the right thing to do and that he expected nothing in return. One sweltering afternoon, as Jim was repairing a fence at the stable, he heard some men joking about the big woman who'd been jilted. Their mocking laughter clawed at him, igniting a spark of anger. Before he could stop himself, Jim confronted them with a scowl. "You got something better to do than gossip about a lady," he growled. The men, two rough cowhands, glared, but Jim's stern expression warned them not to push further. They grumbled a reply about minding his own business and stalked off. As Jim returned to hammering nails, he realized with a start that he was downright protective of Clara, almost as though she were kin. Or more. That evening he found Clara on the boarding house porch again, fanning herself against the unrelenting heat. She greeted him with a weary smile, and they spoke quietly about the day's small triumphs and frustrations. Her needlework, his fence, repairs, the oddities of life in Dodge City. The conversation came easier now, like a gentle stream forging its own path. Midway through the chat, a letter arrived for Clara, postmarked from Philadelphia. Her family, she revealed, had sent a few dollars, urging her to come home and forget her foolish idea of forging a life in the West. Tears pricked at her eyes as she read. "They never believed in me," she murmured. "All they see is my weight, my hopeless, romantic ideals. But I can't just give up. I can't go back to them, tail tucked between my legs." In that moment, Jim Holloway made a decision he never saw coming. He gently took Clara's trembling hand, surprising them both. "Clara," he said quietly, "you didn't travel all this way just to be turned around by one man's cruelty. You deserve better. And maybe I can offer better." Her eyes widened, tears threatening to spill. What do you mean?" Jim inhaled as though bracing himself for an ambush. "I could marry you," he said, voice low and earnest. "I'm no fancy rancher, and I can't promise an easy life. But I've got strong arms and a willingness to work. I figure two lonely souls might stand a better chance together than separate." The night air seemed to hush. Even the crickets paused as if stunned by this declaration. Clara's cheeks burned. "But we hardly know each other. And you're a widower. Don't you want time to—" "I've had time," he said more brusquely than he intended, "and all it's done is leave me drifting. Truth is, you need a friend, a partner. I can be that. Maybe in time it'll grow into something else. But for now, let me help you, and you help me. We'll figure it out together." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were tears of astonishment and relief. "Are you sure?" she asked in a whisper. Jim nodded. "More sure than I've been of anything in a long while." And so it was at midday the following afternoon that Jim Holloway and Clara Davenport stood in front of the modest county clerk's office. Word spread fast in Dodge City. This was a place accustomed to quick weddings, sometimes hasty funerals, and always a whiff of scandal. A small crowd of onlookers gathered curious to see the too fat bride who had been jilted and the rugged widower who offered her a new chance. Mrs. Farnsworth bustled about like a proud hen, fussing over Clara's hair and adjusting her borrowed lace shawl. Jim stood in front of the clerk, a grizzled man named Orville Maddox, who flipped through the official papers with bored efficiency. "I assume you know what you're doing," Maddox remarked, glancing at the pair. "This is the third wedding I've done this week. Half of them don't last a month." Jim's jaw set with quiet resolve. He had no illusions about how precarious this arrangement might be, but he was equally certain that it was the right path, at least for him. Clara's cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright with a tumult of hope and nerves. When Maddox asked if the bride had any vow to say, she trembled with emotion, but found a strength in her voice that seemed to surprise everyone present. "I do," She said the words ringing clear. To stand by him through thick and thin. Jim repeated his vow, acknowledging the unspoken ghosts of his past. He wasn't sure if his heart was truly free to love again, but he vowed to protect and cherish her the best he knew how. They exchanged rings. Simple bands Jim purchased that morning at the local jeweler. Then Maddox pronounced them man and wife. A ripple of applause passed through the small crowd. Farnsworth dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. The onlookers, many of whom had mocked Clara or pitied her, now watched in a curious mix of awe and respect. Jim turned to Clara, lifted her borrowed veil and kissed her gently. In that fleeting moment, the swirl of the town's gossip, the whistle of distant trains and the dusty memories of heartbreak all faded. All that remained was a quiet, fragile promise, one that, come what may, they would face together. As newlyweds, the question now became, where do we go from here? Jim had a small sum of savings, scraped together enough to purchase a horse and perhaps rent a patch of land. With Clara's skill in sewing and her determination to forge her own path, they just might carve out a semblance of a life. They discussed their next move over a celebratory dinner at the Dodge House Hotel, courtesy of Mrs. Farnsworth, who insisted on treating the bride and groom. The fancy meal felt almost surreal: roasted chicken, fresh bread, and even a slice of apple pie. Despite their uncertain future for one evening, at least they savored the taste of possibility. Clara suggested, maybe we should look at that little farm you mentioned, the one near the river. She had a sparkle in her eye. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could nurture a place of their own. Jim nodded, though he was keenly aware of the challenges. The land he'd scouted was far from the better-watered areas, and the soil was stubborn. But what he lacked in fertile ground, he was determined to make up for in grit. We can try, he said, but it won't be easy. We might have to start small, grow a garden, keep a few chickens. Clara smiled softly. I'm not afraid of hard work. The next morning, Jim and Clara stood on the patch of land north of town, dry soil, a rickety barn and a trickling creek. Jim had doubts. It looked unforgiving. But Clara, undeterred, walked the property with a glint of determination. We can make this work, she said, already thinking through ways to coax life from the stubborn earth. By week's end, they'd secured the rental with an option to buy. Some townsfolk doubted they'd last, but Clara sewing for local clients and Jim picking up odd jobs worked hard to prove otherwise. Nights were spent patching the barn and sleeping under stars or hayloft rafters. Their marriage remained tender, uncertain, but growing in quiet strength with every shared hardship. One evening, as they sat around a small campfire near the barn, the sky ablaze with oranges and pinks, Jim found himself telling Clara about his late wife and their daughter who'd died of fever. He spoke haltingly, voice raw. He hadn't voiced these memories in a long while, but something about Clara's presence, her sympathetic silence, her gentle nods unlocked the floodgates. Clara said little, allowing him the space to grieve. Her hand rested on his forearm, a silent gesture of empathy. When he finished, tears shimmered in her eyes. I'm so sorry, she whispered. No one should have to endure such loss. Jim exhaled a shuddering breath. He looked down at the calluses on his hands, as if searching for answers in the dirt beneath his fingernails. I never thought I'd care about someone again, he admitted quietly. But I do care for you, Clara. I'm not sure what that means yet, but I want you to know. Her eyes brimmed with emotion. She squeezed his hand. I care for you too, and I'm here whatever comes. Things began to look promising for the couple. A few folks in town took a liking to Clara's skill with the needle and recommended her to others. Word-of-mouth business trickled in. Meanwhile, Jim gathered supplies to cultivate the land seeds for hardy vegetables, simple irrigation tools for the creek, and a few chickens. It was a precarious start, but it was a start nonetheless. However, the West rarely offers smooth sailing for long. A heat wave rolled across Kansas, scorching the plains. The shallow creek by their property dwindled to a trickle. They hauled water in barrels from a pump a half-mile away, trying to keep the seedlings alive. Clara's cheeks grew sunburned as she bent under the sun, tending each sprout with the tenderness one might give a newborn. During one such grueling day, they received a visitor, an unexpected interruption in the form of Robert Price, the very man who had abandoned Clara at the train station. He rode up on a horse, sweat staining his shirt, arrogance in his posture. Jim and Clara were initially stunned into silence, but soon that silence was replaced by a mixture of anger and anxiety. "What do you want?" Jim asked, standing protectively in front of Clara. Robert tipped his hat with a sneer. "I heard the news that you up and married my bride." He spat on the ground. "Figured I'd come see the spectacle myself." Clara's face paled. She stood her ground, though Jim could see her hands trembling. "You lost the right to call me your bride when you turned and ran," she said, her voice shaking with contained fury. Robert gave a mocking laugh. "I admit I was startled when I saw you that day. Figured I needed a strong woman, but not that strong." His gaze dragged over Clara in a way that made Jim's blood boil. "Then I heard you'd snagged the pity of this widower. Thought maybe I'd pop by to see if you wanted to. Reconsider. Maybe I was too hasty." Jim's hands curled into fists. The audacity of the man was staggering. Clara's lip quivered not out of fear, but raw anger. "You humiliated me," she said, voice rising. "You left me stranded. Why on earth would I want anything to do with you?" Robert shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "I see you're struggling here. The soil's poor, water's near gone. Town folks say you might not last the summer. Meanwhile, I got a decent ranch a ways east, and I'm thinking I could use a wife after all." Before Clara could hurl a response, Jim stepped forward, a quiet rage in his eyes. "You made your choice," he said, voice low. "She's my wife now." Robert's jaw tightened, and for a moment tension crackled in the hot air. Then the scoundrel smirked. "We'll see how long that lasts when your farm goes under. If you change your mind, Miss Davenport, you know where to find me." With a parting sneer, he spurred his horse and rode off. Jim turned to Clara, whose shoulders shook with anger and possibly lingering hurt. He reached for her, but she pulled away, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm sorry you had to see that," he said softly. Her voice was tight. "Don't apologize. He's the one who should be sorry." She swallowed hard, then forced a shaky breath. "We'll make this work, Jim. I won't let his words be right." The encounter with Robert Price left an unsettling undercurrent in their lives. Each day the sun beat down, the crops withered, and the financial strain grew. But Clara and Jim pressed on, fueled by a mixture of pride, anger, and sheer determination. They began waking at dawn to water the plants before the worst heat set in. In the evenings, Clara sewed by lantern light, fulfilling orders for townsfolk, while Jim repaired neighbors' fences or barns to earn a bit more money. Despite the grueling routine, a growing tenderness took root between them, one that extended beyond mere practicality. They found solace in each other's presence, offering gentle words of encouragement in the face of adversity. On one particularly scorching day, Jim caught Clara humming a lullaby as she tended the chickens. Her voice, though soft, carried a sweetness that tugged at his heart. He asked her about it later, and she admitted it was a tune her mother used to sing, one that evoked memories of simpler times. That night, Jim sat beside her on a rough-hewn bench outside the barn, the sky a canopy of stars overhead. "Sing it again," he requested quietly. She obliged, her gentle melody drifting through the still air. For a moment, Jim felt the ache of the past loosen in his chest. He gazed at Clara with something akin to wonder, realizing that they were forging a life from the ashes, two broken souls finding a fragile sense of wholeness together. But the West is never without drama. One afternoon, as Jim was in town picking up a new shipment of feed, Clara heard the distant thunder of horses' hooves approaching their land. Fear quickened her pulse. Had Robert returned to harass her again? To her surprise, it wasn't Robert Price who appeared, but a stranger wearing dusty riding clothes and a battered Stetson. He dismounted and introduced himself as Silas Boyd, a representative of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Instantly, Clara's mind buzzed with questions. Why was a Pinkerton agent here? He politely tipped his hat and explained he was investigating a spate of counterfeit money passing through Dodge City. Clara's brow knit in confusion. She had nothing to do with counterfeiting. However, Silas seemed interested in how she'd come to the West and whether she had any interactions with known criminals. He produced a faded photograph of a man who from the grainy features looked somewhat like Robert Price, though it was hard to be certain. Clara admitted she knew next to nothing about Robert's dealings, only that he was a rancher who'd advertised for a bride. Silas frowned, flipping through his notes. "We've got reason to believe he might be involved in forging banknotes," he said. "If you see anything suspicious, please let me know. I'll be staying at the Dodge house." The agent rode away, leaving Clara with a swirl of apprehension. The idea that Robert Price might be more than just a cruel suitor, that he could be a wanted criminal, added a dangerous dimension to the threat he posed. Clara resolved to tell Jim as soon as he returned. When Jim got back, Clara pulled him aside, describing the Pinkertons' visit in hushed tones. Jim's face hardened. "This complicates things," he muttered, glancing around as though expecting Robert to appear from the shadows. If that man's involved in crime, he might be more desperate, more dangerous. Clara nodded, her heart pounding. They exchanged worried glances, each realizing that the risk to their new life had escalated. Though they had meager means to defend themselves, Jim kept a Colt single-action army revolver tucked in the barn, a real and tangible reminder of how precarious frontier life could be. For safety's sake, Jim insisted that Clara be more cautious in town and not travel alone. Amid these tensions, the daily labor continued unabated. Their crops, once teetering on the brink of failure, began to cling to life thanks to Clara's diligence. A few seedlings even sprouted leaves that promised a modest harvest. The chickens laid eggs regularly, supplementing their diet. If fortune smiled, they might manage to break even this season. One breezy evening, Jim and Clara shared a simple meal outside the barn, eggs from their chickens' cornbread from Clara's sewing money. Clara rubbed her sore shoulder from a long day's work, but smiled. "I feel more alive here than I ever did back east," she said. Jim agreed quietly, amazed at how far they'd come from the train station. Their routine settled. Clara's sewing business picked up, and Jim took on odd jobs, even helping the sheriff. Then a letter arrived, a job offer for Clara from the Harvey house in a distant city. The pay was good, the work steady. As she read the letter aloud, Jim felt a pang torn between wanting what was best for her and not wanting to lose her. "Let's take time to think," Clara said, folding the letter with care. Jim drew in a slow breath. "It's a big opportunity. You could earn a steady living, maybe even send for me once you're set." The words tasted bitter in his mouth, as if he were offering her a ticket away from him. It dawned on him that he didn't want to lose her. Not now. Not after all they'd built, meager as it was. Clara's brow furrowed. She folded the letter carefully, her expression unreadable. I don't want to leave you or this place," she admitted. "But it's a good opportunity, and money's still so tight here. What if the farm fails?" They stood in tense silence for a moment, each grappling with an uncertain future. Ultimately, Clara set the letter aside. "Let's not decide right now. I need time to think." Jim nodded, relieved yet uneasy. He understood that for Clara the lure of a secure position was strong, especially after being discounted and abandoned before. But the more he considered it, the more he felt sure that letting her go would break him. The tension simmered for days. Clara worked on her sewing orders, the letter from Harvey House lying conspicuously on a nearby table like a constant reminder of the fork in the road. Jim threw himself into farm chores, ignoring the pounding sun as he plowed, watered and weeded until sweat soaked through his shirt. Each evening they'd eat dinner with minimal conversation, neither wanting to bring up the possibility of parting ways. The unspoken strain took its toll. One afternoon, as they struggled to repair a leaky irrigation ditch, tempers flared. Frustration with the uncooperative land, the relentless heat, and their uncertain future finally erupted in raised voices. "If you want to leave, just go, Jim," snapped instantly, regretting his harsh tone. "I won't hold you back, Clara." She glared, tears of anger and hurt spilling down her cheeks. "You think I want to leave? I came here for a new life, but all we do is scrape by. And you're shutting me out. Are we partners or not?" He opened his mouth to retort, then hesitated. The realization hit him like a punch. He was pushing her away out of fear that he wasn't enough, that he'd fail her, that she'd decide he wasn't worth staying for. His voice softened. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I'm just afraid." Clara's features gentled, and her tears subsided. She stepped closer, wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand. "I'm afraid too, Jim." She closed her eyes, took a shuddering breath. "But let's promise each other we'll talk about these fears, instead of letting them fester." He nodded, relief washing over him. They embraced, standing together in the dusty field, the sun bearing witness to their fragile but growing bond. Soon after that confrontation, fate dealt them a new card. A freak thunderstorm roared across the plains, dropping precious rain on their parched fields. The drumming of raindrops on the barn's roof was music to their ears. And when dawn broke, they found their crops' revitalized leaves glistening. It was as if nature had decided to grant them a small reprieve. Buoyed by this good fortune, they recommitted to their shared dream. Clara wrote a polite letter to the Harvey house, declining the position for the time being, and explained that she was fulfilling a new venture with her husband. While a part of her felt a pang at relinquishing the security that the job promised, she also sensed a swelling pride in what they were building here, something that was truly theirs. Spirits lifted, they threw themselves into every task, from tending the crops to reinforcing the barn's structure in anticipation of the upcoming autumn. Town folks began noticing their grit. Some even gave them free advice, like old Mr. Walker, who'd farmed that region for decades and knew a thing or two about irrigation techniques. With renewed hope, Jim and Clara also found their personal bond strengthening. Shared struggles had a way of forging intimate connections. For the first time, Jim allowed himself to imagine a future, a real one with Clara by his side. Just when it seemed they'd turned a corner, trouble re-emerged in the form of Robert Price. And this time, he wasn't alone. They'd gone into Dodge City for a supply run when Jim spotted Robert loitering near the general store in the company of two unsavory men. Robert flicked his gaze toward them, smirking darkly. Clara tensed beside Jim, her knuckles white against the fabric of her skirt. They hurried inside the store, hoping to avoid a confrontation, but Robert followed them. "Well, well," he drawled, leaning against the counter. "How's the farming business?" "Clara, you look worn out. Sure you don't want that comfortable ranch with me? A woman like you deserves an easier life." Jim bristled. "Back off," he warned, stepping in front of Clara. Robert's companions exchanged ugly grins. One, a weasel-faced man, eyed Jim and spat on the floor. "Who do you think you are, telling Mr. Price what to do, Mr. Price, the storekeeper, interjected nervously. "Maybe you should leave these folks alone. I don't want no trouble in my establishment." Robert ignored the man, locking eyes with Clara. "Give it time," he said with quiet menace. "You'll see that you made the wrong choice." Then he turned on his heel and exited his henchmen, trailing behind. Jim felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. Clara was visibly shaken, and the other patrons in the store looked uneasy. They all knew the frontier code. Bullies and criminals often had free rein. Jim whispered to Clara, "Let's grab our supplies and go." Outside, they quickly loaded their purchases into their wagon. The presence of Robert's men lingered in the stares of bystanders who expected a showdown. Determined to avoid bloodshed, Jim guided the wagon out of town at a brisk pace, Clara clutching the seat beside him. A swirl of dust trailed behind as they left Dodge City's main street. The ride home was tense. Jim kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting Robert's cronies to follow. Clara's voice shook when she finally spoke. "He won't just give up, will he?" Jim set his jaw, the lines in his face deepening. "No, I don't think he will. But we'll be ready." He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "We might need the law on our side, or at least to warn Sheriff Gordon. Let's not wait until it's too late." Clara nodded her eyes, scanning the horizon. The sense of looming danger overshadowed the fragile peace they'd worked so hard to build. That evening, Jim made good on his word. He left Clara safely at the farm, armed with the Colt revolver in case of emergency, and rode back into Dodge City to speak with Sheriff Gordon. Over a glass of lukewarm water, he recounted the encounter with Robert and expressed his concern about the man's intentions. The sheriff listened with a thoughtful frown. "He's been on my radar for a while," Gordon admitted. "We've had rumors of him running stolen cattle, forging bills, none proven yet. But there's enough smoke that there's bound to be fire. Problem is, the Pinkerton folks haven't pinned anything solid on him either. I can't arrest him on hearsay alone." Jim's frustration mounted. "So what do I do?" "Wait until he shows up with a gun." Gordon sighed, leaning back in his creaky chair. "I don't advise vigilante justice, if that's what you're hinting. But keep your weapon close, protect your wife, and if he sets foot on your land uninvited, let me know. I'll do what I can." Leaving the sheriff's office, Jim felt only partially reassured. The law was a weak shield against a man like Robert Price, who clearly wasn't afraid to bully people into submission. Jim resolved to fortify their property, build a stronger fence, keep watch at night. But in his heart, He feared it might not be enough. Back at the farm, Clara was waiting anxiously in the barn lantern light, throwing flickering shadows on the walls. She exhaled in relief when Jim stepped in. He set aside his hat and embraced her, inhaling the scent of hay and her rosewater perfume. "We'll be all right," he murmured, though a tremor in his voice belied his worry. Clara led him to a makeshift table where she'd set a simple supper of cornbread and beans. They ate in subdued silence. Outside, crickets sang their nightly tune, and the wind rustled the drying grasses. After dinner, they climbed to the loft where their bedroll lay. A swirl of emotions overcame them: fear, uncertainty, and a flicker of hopeful longing for the future they were trying to build. They curled up under a thin blanket, each quietly determined not to let Robert Price destroy what they'd created. Before drifting off to sleep, Clara whispered, "No matter what happens, Jim, I'm with you." He pressed a soft kiss to her temple. "I know, and I'm with you." A few peaceful days followed. Clara poured herself into her sewing, and Jim tackled farm chores with renewed vigor. Their seedlings showed real promise, and the chickens multiplied. Each afternoon, Clara gathered eggs in a wicker basket, while Jim tended to the rows of vegetables that, though modest, could provide a decent harvest if luck held. Yet a sense of foreboding lingered. They often glanced over the fields, half expecting to see a trio of riders approaching. When none came, they cautiously relaxed, hoping that perhaps Robert had moved on or realized Clara would never return to him. Late one afternoon, while Clara was collecting eggs, Jim spotted a rider in the distance. His heartbeat spiked, but as the figure drew closer, he recognized Silas Boyd, the Pinkerton agent. He dismounted near the barn and greeted Jim with a curt nod. "I've got news," Silas said, lowering his voice. "There's been an arrest warrant issued for Robert Price in connection with counterfeit banknotes. We believe he's holed up in a small ranch east of here, maybe a half-day's ride. I need your help, Jim. You know these lands, and if I can get a small posse, we might corner him before he disappears." Jim stared at the agent, wrestling with conflicting emotions. On the one hand, capturing Robert Price could finally end the threat to him and Clara. On the other, confronting a dangerous criminal was no small risk. "You want me to come along?" Silas nodded. "Sheriff Gordon's short-staffed. He'll deputize you for this mission if you agree. We leave at dawn." That evening, Jim explained the situation to Clara. Her eyes widened with concern. "You're going after him?" she asked, voice trembling. "What if something goes wrong?" Jim gently placed his hands on her shoulders. "If we can stop him now, we'll finally have peace. He won't be able to hurt us or anyone again." A storm of emotions warred on Clara's face, but she finally nodded. "Please, be careful." They spent a sleepless night curled together in the barn's loft, each aware of the danger Jim was about to face. Just before dawn, he rose, kissed Clara's forehead, and saddled his borrowed horse. As he trotted away, Clara watched from the barn door, clutching her robe tight against the chilly morning air, silent prayers on her lips. Sheriff Gordon and Silas Boyd met Jim on the outskirts of Dodge City. Accompanying them were two other men from the area ranch hands who'd volunteered for the promise of a bounty. They rode in tense silence, the early morning light casting long shadows on the plains. None knew exactly what to expect, but they were prepared for a gunfight if it came to that. By midday, they approached the ranch believed to be Robert Price's hideout. The land was dotted with a few scraggly cattle, and a dilapidated house crouched near a muddy creek. Smoke curled from the chimney, suggesting occupants inside. They dismounted behind a rise, tethering their horses to scrub brush. The posse planned a cautious approach, hoping to catch Robert off guard. Silas signaled for Jim to circle around the back, while the sheriff led the main group to the front door. As Jim crept along the side of the house, heart pounding, he glimpsed movement through a grimy window. He thought he recognized Robert's tall silhouette pacing the room. Another figure, maybe one of his goons, stood near a table. Adrenaline surged. "It's now or never." Sheriff Gordon pounded on the front door. "Open up! In the name of the law." A tense silence followed, broken only by the rustle of the wind. Then chaos erupted. Gunfire rattled from within the house, bullets slamming into the doorframe and sending splinters flying. "Take cover," Gordon yelled, diving behind a water trough. Silas and the ranch hands scrambled for any available shelter. Jim, positioned at the back, tried to peer through the window to see if he could spot Robert. The door burst open, and 2 men dashed out, guns blazing. Return fire from the posse forced them back behind a broken wagon. Amid the flurry of bullets, Jim noticed a back window slide open. Robert Price climbed out, his face contorted with fury. Locking eyes with Jim for a split second, Robert aimed his revolver and fired. The shot ricocheted off the wall near Jim, sending dust and splinters into the air. Jim dove behind a stack of firewood, returning fire with shaky breath. He was no stranger to firearms, but it had been years since he'd faced such deadly stakes. Another shot zinged past, grazing his arm. Pain flared hot and sharp. Clenching his teeth, Jim forced himself to stay focused, peeking around the woodpile. Robert was trying to make a run for the stables. Ignoring the burn in his arm, Jim sprinted after Robert, weaving between scattered tools and barrels. Behind him, the firefight raged. He heard Silas shouting orders, the sheriff yelling for someone to take the flank. The acrid smell of gunpowder thickened the air. Robert darted into the rickety stable, presumably to mount a horse. Jim slid to a halt outside, pressing himself against the wall. He could hear the frantic whinny of a horse and the clatter of hooves on old planks. Carefully he peeked in, just as Robert swung onto a black mare. In that split second, their eyes locked. Robert raised his revolver. Jim's heart pounded in his ears. He aimed, hand shaking slightly, and squeezed the trigger. The sound thundered in the small space. Robert cried out, his hand jerking, shot going wide. He slumped in the saddle blood, staining his shirt. The startled mare bolted, dragging Robert for a few steps before he tumbled to the ground in a cloud of dust. Jim rushed forward, weapon still drawn, sweat dripping from his brow. Robert lay on his back, eyes fluttering, a red patch blossoming across his chest. "Stupid. Fool," he coughed, blood flecking his lips. Could have had her. Jim stood over Robert, breathing hard, every nerve on edge. Robert's eyes were glassy, the life draining from them. Sheriff Gordon and Silas approached cautiously, guns still in hand. One of the ranch hands took off his hat, a somber expression crossing his features. The gunfight died as the other outlaws realized their leader was down, and they surrendered to the posse. Blood pooled on the stable floor. Robert's breath rattled in his chest. He locked eyes with Jim, hatred burning even as death's shadow passed over him. "She was mine," he managed in a ragged whisper. Jim's expression hardened, remembering Clara's tears, her humiliation, her fear. "No," he said quietly. "She was never yours." Robert's eyelids flickered, and then he went still. In the background, Silas motioned to one of the ranch hands to check the body. "He's gone," the hand confirmed. Sheriff Gordon exhaled, shoulders sagging. "We'll clean up here," Gordon said to Jim. "You're free to go. We'll write this up as self-defense. Hell, you did the territory a favor by taking him down." He was wanted for more crimes than we could count. Jim nodded numbly, adrenaline still coursing. Blood seeped through his torn sleeve, and Silas quickly tore a strip of cloth to bandage the wound. "Get that looked at when you get home," the Pinkerton said. Home. The word reverberated in Jim's mind. Clara. Relief and a wave of trembling overcame him. It's over. He can't hurt us anymore. By the time Jim returned to the farm, the sun was low in the sky, painting everything in a golden hue. Clara rushed out of the barn at the sight of him, eyes wide. He dismounted, gingerly favoring his wounded arm. She gasped, seeing the bandage and the blood staining his shirt. "Oh God, Jim. Are you all right? I'm fine," he managed, forcing a reassuring smile. "Price is gone. He can't harm us anymore." The weight of that statement felt both liberating and sobering. He swallowed hard, recalling the final moments of Robert's life. Clara's eyes brimmed with tears, relief, shock, and gratitude all mingling. She helped him inside, carefully washing and dressing the wound. They worked in silence, though the air between them was charged with emotion. Finally, when the bandage was secure, Clara rested her head against Jim's chest, tears slipping free. He held her gently, one hand stroking her hair. "It's over," he repeated softly, more to himself than to her. She nodded, sniffing back tears. "Thank you," she whispered, "for protecting us." Jim closed his eyes. A swirl of relief, guilt, and exhaustion washed over him. He was no hero. He was simply a man protecting the woman he'd vowed to stand by. But as he cradled Clara in his arms, he felt a deep sense of peace for the first time in years, like he'd finally stepped out of a long, dark shadow into the light. The days that followed passed in a blur of chores, healing, and quiet acceptance of the new reality. Sheriff Gordon confirmed Robert Price was indeed wanted by more than one jurisdiction for crimes ranging from forgery to cattle rustling. The dead man's associates were captured and jailed. The threat that had loomed over Jim and Clara's life had finally vanished, leaving them to focus on building a future without fear. For the first time, they truly sank into the rhythms of married life. Clara's business thrived as word spread that she'd personally aided the downfall of a local outlaw. Her seamstress customers were endlessly curious and ironically flocked to her. Jim found himself at ease, no longer glancing over his shoulder. He expanded their garden, installed a new gate, and even considered adding a few goats to their fledgling homestead. One golden evening after a particularly satisfying day of work, Clara and Jim took a quiet walk around their property. The sun cast a warm glow over the fields, and the soft rustle of the prairie grass serenaded them. Clara slipped her hand into Jim's. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, her tone gentle. "Marrying me so suddenly." Jim stopped turning to face her. The setting sun caught the highlights in her hair, and he marveled at how beautiful she looked. "Never," he said, voice firm. "You saved me from wandering through life with an empty heart. I only regret not meeting you sooner." Clara's eyes filled with grateful tears, and she leaned in, pressing a tender kiss to his lips. Neither was certain what the future held, but they knew that together they'd face whatever came. By autumn's end, their farm stood as a testament to resilience and hope. The crops yielded enough to fill their table and sell a modest surplus at the market. Clara's sewing steadily brought in funds, allowing them to fix the barn's roof and even build a simple wooden house next to it. Just 2 small rooms. But it was theirs. As the first cool winds drifted over the prairie, Jim hung a small sign on the fence Holloway homestead. Seeing his name there, sharing the space with Clara's unspoken presence, filled him with a sense of belonging he'd thought he'd lost forever. Later that day, they stood side by side, admiring the sign. Clara rested a hand on her gently rounding stomach, a new life quickening within her. The discovery had taken them both by surprise, but it felt right, like the blossoming of a hard-won spring after a long winter. Jim slipped an arm around her waist. "How do you feel?" he asked quietly. She smiled, eyes shining, hopeful and ready. He pressed a gentle kiss to her temple. "Me too." A soft breeze carried the scent of hay and the distant murmur of the creek. In that golden moment, the ghosts of the past felt distant and faint. Here on their patch of land, love had found a way. They were no longer two broken souls adrift, but a family rooted in promise, bound by a quiet, unwavering devotion. And so, dear listeners, we come to the end of this dusty trail. Our widower, Jim Holloway, found more than he bargained for. In Dodge City, he discovered hope, renewed purpose, and the kind of love that rises from the ashes of heartbreak. Clara Davenport, once dismissed and abandoned, as too fat, stood tall as a pillar of strength and compassion, transforming not only Jim's life, but her own. Together they claimed a patch of land, overcame lawless threats, and learned that real family is forged by shared trials and tender devotion. If this story stirred your heart, be sure to like this video, share it with friends who love an underdog victory, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss another tale from the wide open plains of the Wild West. Keep your eyes peeled for more stories of grit romance and frontier justice, and until next time, ride safe and dream big.